In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about legality, and for efficiency's sake, we're going to be reusing the section on legality that we had in the rural and remote locations class that we taught earlier this year. So here's the lecture from that class on legality, which will cover everything you need to know. We're going to spend some time talking with you about legality. It's one of the things that people don't think about when they think of making a short-term trip to a rural or remote location or to the wilderness. But legality is important. If you're going to go to these areas, you need to know what your legal liabilities may be. What we put together here are three countries, United States, France, and Australia. We look at them in terms of their responsibilities of the lay responder or the person such as yourself when they're in their areas. Do they have a general duty to assist, notification of authorities, and punishment for failure to assist? We've given you this information here in convenient table form so you can see exactly what's required if you're in those areas. If you're going to be traveling in an area of the world that is remote, rural, or wilderness, you need to know what legal obligations you have should you come upon an emergency scene, and what obligations you may or may not undertake if you engage in providing treatment. In the United States, you don't have to do it, but if you do, you have certain obligations. In other countries, that may differ. You need to be sure of the obligations where you are. We're going to talk here a little bit about state laws. In the United States, we have what are called Good Samaritan laws that exist in all 50 states in this country. Here, you don't have an obligation to provide assistance, but if you start providing assistance, you have certain obligations that you pick up at that point in time. You can be held negligent. There has been a couple of cases where you can be held negligent for failing to call 911 in an emergency if you happen upon an emergency. And in some other countries, mandatory assistance is required, but in the United States, in most of the 50 states, it is not. There are 3 states that, however, where it is required, and those are Wisconsin, Vermont, and Minnesota, I believe. And those states, you're required to, if you happen upon an emergency, to provide assistance, which of course implies that you are trained to provide assistance in those cases. We talk a little bit here again about the Volunteer Protection Act. If you were a part of a large group of volunteers working with an international agency or an agency someplace in the United States for disaster relief, we bring back the horrific scenes of Katrina, or more recently here in Washington State, the Oso landslide, where they had hundreds of volunteers. There you're protected if you're operating in that capacity with a large group for disaster relief under what's called the Volunteer Protection Act of 1997. It's a federal act in the United States. Unless you're engaged in willful negligence, you have absolute protection under this act for whatever you're doing and complying with your duties as a volunteer to this organization. So the Volunteer Protection Act gives you protection for volunteer activities, disaster relief type activities. Now, most of you are familiar with what we covered. We're talking about Introduction to Lay Responders and the CPR, Good Samaritan laws. They exist in all 50 states. In most states, they are designed to protect doctors and EMTs. In a handful of states, Washington is one of them, the Good Samaritan law is designed to protect you, the lay responder, the person who doesn't have any specialized medical training, if they decide to render help in an emergency. Here we have a copy of that law so you can peruse it. We've reviewed it already. We're going back over this material once again so you're familiar with it. Remember that once you start providing aid, you have to follow certain steps, which we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes. But the basic tenet of the act is it protects any person, not limited to a volunteer providing emergency services or medical services, who without compensation, okay? So here are the rules. Remember, the rules are SMACK, S-M-A-C-K. Stay within the scope of your training. Don't try to do anything outside of your training. You're not there to provide. You can never provide surgery. You can never administer or recommend medications. You can never ask for any type of money for providing emergency services. In order to get protection under most Good Samaritan Acts within the United States, most of Europe and South America, you have to do so freely, and you cannot be practicing medicine without a license, which means you cannot perform surgeries, you cannot try to diagnose, you cannot administer medications, and you don't try to charge a person for any type of money. You also want to ask permission, always ask permission. You also want to check for injuries and call 911 as soon as possible. And once you start giving aid, keep giving aid until relieved. So now we've covered the legalities. We've talked about international laws. We've talked about national laws. We've talked about state laws. You want to be aware of the legal implications as you travel through your wilderness or remote location. So you need to take a review, take a quick look at what the laws are in that area to see what your responsibilities are should you be involved in an emergency. All right, we're going to move on to our next lecture.